My husband signed 6 more years in the military without telling me, then spent his re-enlistment bonus on jewelry for another woman. When I confronted him at the FRG Christmas party, he called me hysterical and said, "You knew what you signed up for." I just stared at him. That was 8 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my house in tears. My mom was the definition of a military spouse. She could pack an entire house in 48 hours, make friends at every new base within a week, and somehow kept 3 kids fed, clothed, and in school through 8 different moves. She ran every FRG meeting while Dad was deployed, organized care packages for the whole unit, and never missed sending him his favorite beef jerky even when money was tight. She was the one other spouses called at 3 a.m. when they couldn't handle another night alone. Dad was coming up on his 20 years, and Mom had been planning for this moment since deployment number 3. She'd saved every penny she could, researched real estate in Colorado where her sister lived, even picked out the exact house she wanted with the wraparound porch. "Just 1 more year," she kept saying. "Then we can finally plant roots, have a real home. The kids can finish high school in one place." The re-enlistment ceremony was supposed to be next Tuesday. Mom thought it was Dad's retirement ceremony. She'd invited her whole family from Colorado, bought a new dress. Hell, she even made a photo album of all our moves titled The Journey to Home. I helped her glue every picture. There was one of her crying in the driveway of our first base housing, pregnant with me. Another of her painting my sister's room for the 4th time in a different house. She'd written little notes under each one. Things like move number 3, left behind the garden I planted, and move number 6, Tommy's best friend stayed here. But here's the thing nobody knew. Dad had already re-enlisted 3 months ago, signed another 6 years without saying poop, and that wasn't even the worst part. Mom found out at the FRG Christmas party. We were all there, the whole battalion family thing, kids running around with cookies, some colonel's wife talking about resilience or whatever. Mom was helping serve punch when she overheard 2 lieutenants' wives gossiping by the dessert table. "Did you see Major Wilson with Captain Brooks at the PX yesterday? They weren't even trying to hide it anymore." The other one laughed. 20 years his wife's been waiting, and he's spending his re-enlistment bonus on jewelry for another woman. Mom's hand froze on the ladle. I watched her face change, real slow, like watching ice form on a window. She set down the punch, walked straight across that community center, and stood right in front of Dad. He was laughing with some other officers by the Christmas tree. "Is it true?" That's all she said, real quiet. Everyone around them stopped talking. Dad's face did this thing where he tried to look confused. "Honey, what are you?" "The re-enlistment. Captain Brooks. Is it true?" The whole room was dead silent. Even the kids stopped running around. You could hear the shitty Christmas music playing from someone's phone. Dad straightened his uniform, looked her right in the eye. "We should discuss this at home." Mom laughed. Not a real laugh, the kind that makes your skin crawl. 20 years I've waited for you to come home. Really come home. Not just between deployments. Not just for a weekend. Home. Her voice was getting louder. "I've been the married single mother. I've been the mover, the packer, the keeper of everything while you played soldier. And you couldn't even tell me you signed away 6 more years of my life?" Some colonel tried to step in, saying something about maintaining decorum. Mom turned on him. "Decorum? Decorum? Where was decorum when I was in labor with our 2nd child and he was in Iraq? Where was decorum when I had to explain to our son why Daddy missed his high school graduation for a training exercise?" She turned back to Dad. "And Brooks? Really? She's 23 years old." Dad's jaw tightened. "Linda, you're being hysterical. This is what military wives do. You knew what you signed up for. Maybe if you understood sacrifice." "Sacrifice?" Mom pulled out her phone, started scrolling. "Let me tell you about sacrifice. I have 4,000 photos on this phone. You're in 217 of them. I know because I counted. I counted while you were deployed." Again, she threw the phone at his chest. It bounced off his medals. "I sacrificed my career, my family, my friends, my sanity, my children's stability, everything. For what? So you could fuck your coworker and sign up for more years without asking? You're embarrassing yourself," Dad said, picking up her phone from the floor. "And me, in front of my command." Mom nodded real slow. "You're right. I am embarrassing myself, believing for 20 years that this would end, that I mattered as much as your precious career." She looked around the room at all the other wives. Some were crying. Most were just staring. "How many of you are waiting for retirement too? How many of you think it'll be different when they hit 20? Nobody answered. Mom walked over to the dessert table, picked up the sheet cake that said, "Merry Christmas 4th Battalion Families," in red and green frosting, walked back to Dad, and dumped the entire thing on his dress blues. The frosting hit his medals with this wet splat sound that made Katie gasp behind me. Red and green icing dripped down Dad's chest onto his shiny shoes, while chunks of yellow cake stuck to his ribbons. The whole room just froze. 300 people watching cake slide off Major David Wilson's dress blues onto the waxed floor of the Fort Carson Community Center. Colonel Miller pushed through the crowd and stopped right in front of Dad, his face turning purple. He didn't even look at Mom, just stared at the mess on Dad's uniform and said real quiet that Dad better be in his office at 0600 tomorrow. Then he turned and walked out. That's when everyone started whispering. Mom stood there for maybe 5 more seconds watching the frosting pool around Dad's feet before she turned and headed for the door. I grabbed Katie's hand and Sarah grabbed her other one and we followed Mom out while the whole battalion watched. The cold hit us hard in the parking lot. Mom's hands were shaking so bad she couldn't get the keys out of her purse. Tommy took them from her and unlocked the minivan. He helped her into the passenger seat, then got behind the wheel even though he only had his learner's permit. Sarah climbed in back with Katie, who kept asking why Mommy threw cake at Daddy. Mom just stared out the window at the mountains while Tommy drove us home. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The house felt different when we walked in. All Mom's retirement party decorations were still up from when she'd been setting up earlier. The banner that said "Finally Home" hung across the living room. The photo album she'd made was sitting open on the kitchen table. Tommy helped Mom to a chair chair while Sarah took Katie upstairs for bed. Mom picked up the album and stared at this picture of herself pregnant with Tommy at Fort Bragg. She looked so young. After a long time, she pulled out her phone and typed something. I saw over her shoulder she'd texted Aunt Margaret just 2 words. I need you. Then she set the phone down and kept looking at that photo album. We stayed up with her until after midnight, but Dad never came home. Mom couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard the garage door open and saw her car backing out. I followed her. She drove back to the community center, and sure enough, Dad's car was still there in the same spot. 3 spaces over was Captain Brooks' red Honda Civic. Mom sat there for a minute, then pulled out her phone and took pictures of both cars. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. She drove home and made coffee. At exactly 7 a.m., we heard Dad's key in the lock. He walked in still wearing his dress blues from last night with dried cake all over them. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee. Dad looked at her and said she'd destroyed his career, that Miller was considering Article 15 proceedings, that she'd humiliated him in front of his entire command. Mom set down her mug and said one word: divorce. Dad actually laughed. He said she had no idea what she was starting and that he knew every JAG lawyer on base. Then he went upstairs and packed a bag. After he left, Mom called the base legal assistance office. The paralegal who answered said they couldn't help her since Dad was military too. Conflict of interest. But she whispered that Mom should find a civilian attorney fast because Dad had already called trying to freeze their bank accounts. Mom hung up and went to the garage. That's where Tommy found her an hour later, surrounded by all the boxes she'd labeled for the retirement move to Colorado. She was crying. Tommy sat down next to her and pulled out his phone. Someone had posted a video of the cake incident on TikTok. It already had 50,000 views. The comments were all supporting Mom. He put his arm around her and said everyone was on her side. That's when Mom really broke down. Margaret got there that afternoon. She took one look at Mom and immediately took charge. She'd brought the business card for her divorce attorney from Denver and $5,000 cash. She said Dad didn't know about their mother's inheritance money that she'd been managing for Mom all these years. Mom just nodded. 2 days later, Dad came back to get his things. Brooks waited in her car in our driveway while Dad walked through the house filling boxes. He announced he was moving into the bachelor officer quarters on base. He wanted the kids every other weekend starting immediately. Katie ran to him and hugged his leg, but Tommy and Sarah stayed in the kitchen. They wouldn't even look at him. After he left, Mom met with the attorney Margaret had recommended. Jennifer Martinez specialized in military divorces. Her first question was whether Dad had been hiding money. She explained that reenlistment bonuses for 20-year majors were typically $45,000. Mom checked every account she had access to. That money was nowhere. The next morning, an official envelope showed up at our door with the base housing office seal on it. I'm really curious how Mom kept track of exactly 217 photos out of 4,000. Did she count them during all those lonely nights? The cake hitting those metals must have made such a specific sound, and I wonder if anyone filmed it before that TikTok. How did Margaret know to bring exactly $5,000 cash? I opened it right there on the porch and my hands started shaking. Dad had removed me as an authorized resident 3 days ago. I had 30 days to vacate the premises. The letter said only service members and their listed dependents could occupy military housing. My name wasn't on the list anymore. I walked back inside and found Tommy at the kitchen table doing his calculus homework. He looked up when I came in and I saw the dark circles under his eyes. He'd been staying up late helping Katie with her nightmares while I was dealing with lawyers and paperwork. My 17-year-old was being the parent I should have been. I sat down next to him and he pushed his homework aside. He told me he'd been handling things so I could focus on the divorce stuff. Said he knew I needed to fight Dad, but the girls needed someone stable right now. That's when Sarah came downstairs carrying this beat-up purple notebook. She sat across from us and opened it to the first page. December 15th, 2014. It said at the top. Dad missed my piano recital for an optional training exercise. She flipped through page after page. Every birthday he missed. Every school play. Every parent-teacher conference. She'd been tracking it all since she was 10 years old. 6 years of documentation. She pushed the notebook across the table and said she knew I'd need it someday. The phone rang before I could respond. It was Janet Morrison, the FRG president. She said we needed to talk about my position as volunteer coordinator. Half the wives were demanding I step down after the Christmas party incident. The other half said they'd quit if I was forced out. Janet's voice got quiet, and she said David had been calling people, telling them I was having a mental breakdown, that I was unstable and shouldn't be around the other families. She didn't believe him, but some of the senior officers' wives were listening. I thanked her and hung up. 2 hours later, I was at Katie's elementary school because they'd called about an emergency. I found David in the principal's office with a stack of forms. He was trying to remove me from the authorized pickup list and change the emergency contacts to just himself and Brooks. The principal, Mrs. Wright, was refusing to make any changes without my written consent. David stood up when I walked in and started yelling about parental alienation, said I was poisoning the kids against him, that I was keeping them from their father. Mrs. Wright called security when he grabbed my arm. 2 security guards had to escort him out while he kept shouting about his rights as a father. The principal apologized and assured me nothing would change without my permission. Jennifer called that afternoon with news about the financial records. She'd gotten the subpoena approved and found the reenlistment bonus. All $45,000 sitting in an account David opened 3 months ago at a credit union off base. Just his name on it. But that wasn't the worst part. There were charges going back 6 months. Jewelry purchases at the mall, hotel rooms at the Broadmoor, expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to. The affair started way before the reenlistment. He'd been planning this for half a year. Margaret picked me up the next morning and drove me to a therapist who specialized in military spouse trauma. Dr. Patricia Reeves had a small office near the base. I sat in her beige waiting room for 10 minutes before she called me in. I couldn't talk at first. 20 years of stuff just sat there in my throat. She waited, didn't push. Finally, I started talking talking about the first deployment when I was 22 and pregnant and alone. About the second one when Tommy was a baby and I had mastitis and no help. About all the moves and the lost friends and the careers I never started. She listened to all of it. At the end, she gave me a yellow legal pad and told me to document everything from now on. Every interaction with David, every threat, every attempt to manipulate the kids. Said it would help in court. Tommy had basketball practice that Thursday and I went to pick him up. Coach Williams pulled me aside while Tommy was in the locker room. He said David had called trying to remove me from the pickup authorization list there too. Coach Williams was a retired sergeant major who'd seen plenty of messy military divorces. He told me he'd informed Major Wilson exactly where he could shove his requests. Said Tommy was a good kid who didn't need this drama and he'd make sure I could always get my son from practice. Small victory, but I needed it. When I got home, I decided to check the mail since David hadn't been by in days. That's when I found them. Credit card statements hidden behind the water bill. 3 different cards I didn't know existed. $30,000 in debt. All recent charges. I went through every transaction. A $1,200 bracelet from Tiffany. Monthly payments on an apartment lease off base. Furniture from Ashley Home Store. He'd been setting up a whole new life with Brooks using credit cards in both our names. My credit was destroyed and I hadn't even known. Katie found me crying over the statements. She climbed into my lap and asked if Daddy didn't love us anymore. I held her tight and tried to find the right words. I told her Daddy loved her, but sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people. She looked up at me with those big brown eyes and said she knew. Said it was like when he promised to come to her spring play but went to work instead. Or when he said he'd teach her to ride a bike but never did. Even my 8-year-old had figured it out. 2 days before Christmas, the doorbell rang. It was Chaplain Morrison from the battalion. He wasn't there officially, he said, just as a concerned friend. He sat in my living room and told me several senior NCO wives had come to him about David and Brooks. They'd seen them together at restaurants, at the movies, even at a hotel in Denver 6 months ago. He couldn't take sides in a divorce, but he suggested I request David's deployment records from personnel. Said there might be discrepancies between his official travel and where he actually was. Gave me the form number and the office to contact. I spent the next 2 days at the personnel office filling out forms and waiting for records to print. The clerk kept giving me these looks like she knew exactly what I was doing. December 21st. I needed groceries and headed to the commissary, even though I usually avoided it on weekends when it was packed with families. I was grabbing milk when I saw Captain at the deli counter. She turned to reach for something and that's when I saw it. My grandmother's antique sapphire ring on her right hand. The one that went missing during our move from Germany 3 years ago. The one I'd filed an insurance claim for. The one I'd cried about losing because it was supposed to go to Sarah. Captain saw me staring and actually smirked. She knew I couldn't prove anything without making another scene. I left my cart right there and walked out. Called Jennifer from the parking lot and told her to file the papers immediately. She'd been waiting for my go-ahead and said Major would be served at his office tomorrow morning. I knew this would blow everything up, but I was done being careful. December 23rd. I parked across from the base legal office at 0900. Watched the process server walk in with the papers. 20 minutes later, Major came storming out holding the envelope. He looked right at my car and I didn't look away. His face went from confused to pure rage when he realized I was watching. He started walking toward me, but his phone rang and he stopped to answer it. Probably his lawyer. I drove home and found Margaret already there with boxes. She'd driven down from Colorado to help me pack his stuff. We started with the bedroom and that's when we found them. Love letters from Captain hidden inside his field manuals. Dated from his last deployment when I was sending care packages every week. She was writing about their future together while I was writing about Tommy's grades and Sarah's dance recital. Margaret held me while I threw up in the bathroom. Christmas Eve came and I tried to make it normal for the kids. We were decorating cookies when the doorbell rang at 11 p.m. Major was drunk and yelling about taking the kids for Christmas morning. Tommy grabbed his phone and started recording while Margaret called the MPs. He kept screaming about how I'd ruined his career and his life. The kids watched from the stairs as the MPs cuffed him and put him in the patrol car. Katie was crying and Sarah just stood there frozen. The arrest report would help my case, but watching my kids see their dad like that broke something in me. December 26th. Colonel called personally. Said Major's security clearance was under review after the arrest. Then he mentioned something about the family care plans Major filed during deployments. Said I might want to request copies because there were some interesting inconsistencies about who was listed as emergency contacts. Jennifer scheduled Captain's deposition for the 27th. Captain showed up thinking she'd help Major, but when Jennifer showed her photos from family events on the same dates she claimed they were together, her story changed. She admitted the affair but said Major told her we were separated. When she saw the family Christmas card from last year, she went pale. Her testimony became our strongest evidence. December 28th. Tommy asked to talk to me alone. He pulled out his laptop and showed me audio files. He'd been recording Major's phone calls to the house for months using an app on his computer. Said he was worried about me after seeing how Major acted during his last visit home. The recordings had Major talking to someone named Marcus Bradley about moving money around. Tommy had 43 recordings total. I hugged him and told him he shouldn't have had to do that, but I was proud of him for protecting our family. Wow. Sarah kept a notebook for 6 whole years tracking every time her dad missed something important. That takes serious dedication for a 10-year-old to start doing. How did she know way back then that she'd need proof someday? Jennifer ran the name Marcus Bradley and found out he'd been helping Major invest deployment pay in cryptocurrency accounts I never knew existed. The digital wallet had $75,000 that should have been in our savings. Money from combat pay and reenlistment bonuses I thought went to bills. Jennifer added financial fraud to the divorce filing. December 30th. We were eating dinner when Sarah suddenly started crying. She rolled up her sleeves and showed me cuts all up her arms. Said she'd been doing it since Major's last deployment. I held her while she sobbed about not being able to handle the pressure of being the perfect military military kid anymore, called the base mental health crisis line, and got her an emergency appointment for the next morning. That night, I lay awake realizing the real cost of 20 years of this life wasn't just my sacrifices. January 2nd came fast, and the courthouse was packed with military families since everyone came back from holiday leave at the same time. Major showed up in his dress blues with every medal he'd ever earned pinned to his chest, while I wore the same black suit I'd bought for my dad's funeral 3 years ago. Jennifer had printed out every crypto transaction from the past 6 months and organized them in a binder with tabs marking each month. The judge was this older woman who kept adjusting her glasses while she read through the evidence. Major tried to explain how the crypto was just an investment for our future, but Jennifer pulled up the blockchain showing transfers to Captain's wallet address that matched dates when he claimed to be at training exercises. The judge asked him directly if he'd been hiding assets, and he started talking about his service record and sacrifice for the country. She cut him off and ordered $3,000 monthly support, plus he had to keep us on his military health insurance. Major's face went red, but he couldn't say anything with his JAG lawyer right there. 2 days later, I ran into Jessica from the spouses coffee group at the commissary, and she pulled me aside near the frozen foods. She told me Major had been going around the battalion telling everyone I was having a mental breakdown and making up stories about him. Said he'd even talked to the family readiness officer about getting emergency custody because I was unstable. I started showing up at every battalion event after that. The monthly spouse luncheon where I helped set up tables. The change of command ceremony where I stood in the front row smiling. The kids' Easter egg hunt where I volunteered to hide eggs. Major would see me there acting completely normal while he was getting more and more stressed about the investigation Jennifer had told me was happening behind the scenes. Katie's teacher called me in the second week of January saying Katie had been telling all her classmates that her daddy was a hero who fought bad guys and saved people. She'd been drawing pictures of him in uniform fighting monsters and telling kids that he was too busy being a hero to come to school events. The teacher said it seemed like Katie was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. That's when I realized all 3 kids needed their own therapists, not just Sarah. Margaret was staying with us to help with the kids, and she was going through mail when she found credit card statements I didn't recognize. 3 different cards all in my name that I'd never applied for. The charges went back 8 months and included hotel rooms, jewelry stores, and restaurant bills at places I'd never been. Margaret drove straight to the police station and filed identity theft charges while I called Jennifer to add it to our case. The fraud department said this was becoming common in military divorces where one spouse had access to all the personal information needed to open accounts. Brooks showed up at my house on a Tuesday morning when the kids were at school. She stood on my porch in civilian clothes looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Said she wanted to testify about everything if I agreed not to sue her for alienation of affection. She handed me printed screenshots of texts where Major called me psycho and manipulative while planning their future together. Messages where he said I was too stupid to find the money he was hiding. She had hundreds of them saved. I took the papers and told her to talk to Jennifer. Started going to a military spouse divorce support group that met Wednesday nights in the church basement off post. Met Patricia, whose ex-husband had done the same financial tricks but worse. She showed me how to check for other hidden accounts and walked me through protecting my credit. She'd been divorced 2 years and said the first year was hell, but it got better. Her ex was stationed in Korea now and hardly saw their kids. January 15th, Major's command officially gave him a letter of reprimand for conduct unbecoming an officer. His promotion board for lieutenant colonel got canceled indefinitely. He left me a voicemail screaming that I'd ruined his career and destroyed 20 years of work. Jennifer saved it to the evidence file before I could delete it. Tommy got suspended the next week for fighting another military kid who'd been repeating Major's lies about me being crazy. The principal called me in and said he understood why Tommy reacted, but rules were rules. I watched my son sit in that office with his fists still clenched and his eye swelling shut because he'd tried to defend me from his dad's lies. That night, Margaret found me in the kitchen at 3 in the morning looking through old photo albums from when the kids were babies. I told her sometimes I missed the man I thought I married, the one in these pictures who looked happy holding baby Tommy. She sat down next to me and said that man never existed because I'd been in love with who I needed him to be, not who he was. January 20th. Jennifer called to tell me the JAG office had opened an informal investigation into Major's use of government resources. They'd found emails to Captain on his military account and phone records showing personal calls during duty hours. The investigation was separate from our divorce, but would definitely affect his security clearance and career. 2 days later, Jennifer called me at work and her voice was different, tight like she was trying not to yell. Major had filed for full custody of all 3 kids, claiming I was mentally unstable and violent. He'd attached photos of the cake mess at the Christmas party and statements from 3 officers saying I'd lost control and assaulted him with food. Jennifer said he was demanding psychological evaluations for everyone including the kids and warned me this was going to get ugly and expensive fast. The court approved his request and I had to meet with a psychologist named Dr. Freeman the following week in a cold office that smelled like old coffee and cleaning supplies. She asked me about everything, the moves, the deployments, waiting alone with 3 kids while Major was gone for months, and I just talked for 2 hours straight while she took notes on a yellow pad. When I went back for the results, she looked at me different, softer, and said I had complex PTSD from 20 years of military spouse isolation, and that my reaction at the party was actually normal, given the accumulated trauma I'd been carrying. She wrote a 12-page report documenting everything, and Jennifer said it actually made our case stronger, because it showed exactly what being a military wife had done to me. January 25th. Sarah's therapist called to say she'd had a breakthrough and stopped cutting herself completely. Started journaling instead about all the times Major had promised to be there and wasn't. The therapist said Sarah wanted to testify about his absence and broken promises, but I didn't want to put her through that. Didn't want her in the middle middle of our mess. I was washing dishes that night when I saw headlights in the driveway, but nobody got out of the car, and after 20 minutes I realized it was Major's truck just sitting there watching the house. This happened 3 more nights that week, always around 2 in the morning according to the kitchen clock, him just sitting in his truck staring at our windows. I bought security cameras from Walmart the next day, and set them up myself with Tommy's help, and over the next 2 weeks we caught him on video 7 different times, just parked outside watching like some creep. February 1st, Jennifer took the footage to court, and the judge granted a restraining order immediately, said Major had to stay 500 feet from the house except for court-ordered visits with the kids. The base got notified about the order, which made things worse for his career on top of the JAG investigation. 3 days later, Captain showed up at my door with a USB drive and said she'd been reassigned to Fort Hood because the scandal was affecting unit cohesion, but before she left, she wanted me to have something. The drive had hundreds of emails between her and Major planning their life together after his divorce, including one where he called me the parasite and talked about hiding money in accounts I didn't know about. Jennifer's forensic accountant found those accounts, plus discovered Major had been selling military gear online for years and keeping the cash, which was technically stealing government property, and Jennifer had to decide whether to report it to CID, which would end his career completely. February 8th, Tommy got his college acceptance letter with a full ROTC scholarship to Colorado State, and when he told me he was turning it down because he didn't want to be like his dad, I felt my heart break. I told him he was nothing like Major, that he had his own dreams and shouldn't let his father ruin them, but he said he'd seen what the military did to families and couldn't do that to anyone. Patricia from my support group gave me a number for a female veteran lawyer who'd handled her own military divorce, and when I called her, she warned me Major would probably drag this out until his retirement date to protect his pension, that it was a common tactic. The way Sarah's been hiding those cuts makes me wonder how many military kids are dealing with secret pain like this while trying to look perfect on the outside. How does someone keep that hidden for so long? Valentine's Day. I woke up to roses on my doorstep with a letter from Major begging me to forgive him and take him back, saying he'd made mistakes but we could work it out for the kids. I called the police immediately because he'd violated the restraining order, and when they arrested him at the base, it made the front page of the base newspaper with the headline, "Decorated Officer Arrested for Domestic Incident," which pretty much destroyed what was left of his reputation. Katie started seeing the school counselor twice a week, and the drawings she brought home made my chest hurt. Every single one had the same thing. Our family standing together, and then this black figure way off to the side. The counselor said it was normal for kids to process trauma through art, but watching my 6-year-old color her dad in nothing but black crayon, while the rest of us got bright colors, felt like watching her childhood die in real time. Progress was slow, and some nights she'd wake up screaming for daddy, then remember why he wasn't there and cry harder. February 20th, I got a certified letter from the base that made me sit down hard on the kitchen floor. Major was being forcibly retired at exactly 20 years due to multiple conduct violations, including the restraining order violation and what they called behavior unbecoming an officer. His pension would be available for division in the divorce proceedings. Jennifer called it the best case scenario we could hope for since it meant guaranteed income for the kids. Margaret came over that afternoon with wine to celebrate, but stopped cold when she saw my laptop open on the kitchen table. She'd been helping me organize tax documents when she noticed an email in my spam folder from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said something about family testimony, and when she clicked it open, her face went white. Major had been emailing my parents who I hadn't spoken to in 10 years, my parents who were drunk more often than sober when I was growing up, my parents who forgot to feed me for days at a time and left me alone at 8 years old to go to the bar. He'd found them somehow and was trying to get them to testify that I'd always been unstable and unfit. The email had their response saying they'd be happy to help their son-in-law get custody of their grandkids they'd never even met. Margaret grabbed my phone and called Jennifer immediately while I just stared at the screen, feeling like I was 8 years old again, hiding in my closet while they screamed at each other downstairs. Sarah found me crying in the bathroom an hour later and sat down next to me on the floor. She said she wanted to go to the next court hearing and pulled out this letter she'd written to the judge about wanting to live with me. Her therapist had helped her write it and thought it would be good for her healing process. I read it right there on the bathroom floor and realized my 14-year-old daughter was stronger than I'd ever been at her age. She wrote about how I was the one who stayed, and how Major always chose the army over us, and how she didn't want to live with someone who made her feel like she wasn't worth staying for. March 1st, the custody evaluator showed up at 7 in the morning with a clipboard and started watching everything. How I made breakfast and got the kids ready for school and helped with homework and managed bedtime routines. She interviewed their teachers who all said the kids were doing better now than they had in months. She talked to their therapists and coaches, and even the neighbor who watched Katie after school sometimes. I kept everything normal as possible, even though having someone document every move I made felt like being under a microscope. Margaret stayed close that whole week, helping with dinners and school runs so I wouldn't look overwhelmed. Then Jennifer called with news that made my skin crawl. Major was already dating some private who'd just turned 21. Part of me felt relief thinking maybe he'd leave us alone now, but mostly I worried about this girl who had no idea what she was getting into. The evaluator scheduled Major's visitation observation for the next Saturday, and it went exactly as bad as I knew it would. Katie wrapped herself around my leg and wouldn't let go, no matter how much Major demanded she come with him. Tommy flat out refused to get in his car, and when Major grabbed his arm, Tommy pulled away and said he'd call the police if Major touched him again. Sarah went, but didn't say a single word the entire visit, according to the evaluator's notes. Major lost it completely and started yelling at Tommy right there in my driveway about respect and following orders like Tommy was one of his soldiers, instead of his 15-year-old son. The evaluator wrote everything down, and I saw her taking pictures of Tommy's face face when he started crying. March 10th. I was making dinner when I heard car doors slamming and drunk voices in my front yard. My parents had somehow gotten my address and showed up demanding to see their grandchildren they'd abandoned before the kids were even born. They were both wasted, and my mom was screaming about her rights as a grandmother, while my dad pounded on the door so hard the frame shook. Margaret called 911 while I got the kids upstairs and locked them in my bedroom. Tommy stood guard at the door with his baseball bat while Sarah held Katie, who was sobbing. The police showed up fast and arrested them both for drunk and disorderly, but not before the whole neighborhood saw the show. Jennifer said it actually helped our case because it showed I'd protect the kids from any threat, even my own parents. Tommy met with the custody evaluator the next week and brought his own evidence. 3 years worth of text messages where Major canceled on his games and school events and birthdays for training exercises or optional deployments or unit functions. Screenshots of Major saying his career came first, and the family needed to understand that. Messages where Tommy begged his dad to come to just one baseball game, and Major responded that military service required sacrifice from everyone. The evaluator asked Tommy what he wanted, and Tommy said he wanted to stay with the parent who actually showed up. The last thing Jennifer discovered before our next hearing was that Major had never updated his military life insurance after the divorce filing. Me and the kids were still the beneficiaries of a $400,000 policy, and he couldn't change it now without court permission because of the divorce proceedings. It was a small win, but knowing the kids would have that security if something happened felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in months. March 15th came with a thick envelope from the custody evaluator that Jennifer handed me in her office with this look on her face like she was giving me a winning lottery ticket. The report was 42 pages of observations and interviews and psychological assessments, but the recommendation was right there on page 3 in bold letters saying primary physical custody should go to me with supervised visitation for Major, initially due to documented anger management issues, and the children's clearly stated preferences. Jennifer was already pulling out her phone to call Major's lawyer when we heard shouting from the waiting room, and then Major burst through the door with the receptionist trying to block him. His face was red and he was waving his own copy of the report and yelling about bias and how the evaluator was clearly man-hating and didn't understand military culture. Jennifer stood up real calm and told him he needed to leave or she'd call security, but Major just kept going, saying I'd poisoned the kids against him and manipulated the whole system. The receptionist had already hit the panic button, and 2 security guards showed up within minutes to escort Major out while he kept shouting about how this wasn't over and he'd appeal everything. 3 days later, I packed the kids into the car for spring break at Margaret's cabin up in the mountains near Woodland Park. Tommy actually smiled when we pulled up to the A-frame house surrounded by pine trees, and Sarah immediately grabbed Katie's hand to go explore the creek out back. We spent the whole week doing normal stuff like making pancakes and playing board games and hiking to this waterfall Margaret knew about. Katie didn't ask about her dad once, and Tommy started talking about maybe trying out for the school play next year. Sarah helped me cook dinner every night, and we'd stay up late watching old movies on Margaret's ancient VHS player. On our last night there, Katie crawled into my lap during the movie and whispered that she wished we could stay forever. When we got back, Jennifer called to say Major's lawyer had requested mediation instead of going to trial. She explained that they were probably realizing they were losing, and trials are expensive plus traumatic for everyone, especially the kids. I agreed, but told her I had firm boundaries about what I'd accept, including supervised visitation, until Major completed anger management and full physical custody for me. Jennifer said she'd draft up our terms and send them over. That same week, Sarah asked if I could read her college essay for her AP English class about resilience. She handed me her laptop, and I started reading about this woman who'd given up everything for her family and spent 20 years invisible until she finally learned to fight back. It took me 3 sentences to realize she was writing about me. She described watching me pack up our lives over and over and seeing me cry in the car after dropping Dad at the airport for deployments, and how I'd finally stood up at that Christmas party. The last paragraph said her mom taught her that real strength isn't staying silent, but knowing when to speak up. I had to close the laptop because I couldn't see through the tears. Katie drawing her dad as a black figure separate from the family makes me wonder how kids' brains process big changes like this. Do they naturally use colors to show feelings they can't put into words yet? April 1st came fast, and we showed up at the mediator's office downtown in this boring gray building. Major walked in wearing jeans and a polo shirt instead of his uniform, and he looked smaller somehow without all those ribbons and medals. The mediator was this older woman named Patricia, who'd been doing military divorces for 15 years. Major started right away offering a 60-40 custody split, saying he should get them summers and every other weekend. I told Patricia that wouldn't work given the custody evaluator's recommendations and Major's refusal to address his anger issues. Patricia looked through all our documentation, and after 2 hours, she sided with me saying supervised visitation was appropriate until Major completed a certified anger management program. Major's lawyer whispered something to him and his jaw got all tight, but he nodded. Then we moved to finances, and Major tried to claim he should keep his entire pension because I, quote, never worked or contributed financially. Jennifer pulled out 3 boxes of documentation she'd been collecting for months. 20 years of FRG meeting minutes I'd run, and events I'd organized, and care packages I'd coordinated. She had receipts for every move I'd managed alone while Major was deployed, including the moving company contracts I'd negotiated and the deposits I'd handled. She showed how I'd maintained our household through 8 deployments, keeping everything running while he was gone for a combined 7 years. Patricia started calculating on her computer, adding up what my labor would have cost if Major had hired people to do everything I did. Moving coordinators and household managers and childcare and event planning and all the volunteer work that kept his career advancing because officers' wives are expected to be involved. The total came to over $400,000 $400,000 in unpaid labor supporting his military career. Major's lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear, and Major's face kept getting redder. Patricia said, "Given my substantial non-monetary contributions to the marriage and Major's career advancement, the pension should be split 50-50. 2 days later, Katie came home from her supervised visit with Major and climbed straight into my lap. She said Daddy made her feel sad because he kept asking questions about what Mommy was doing and who came to our house. I documented everything in the notebook Jennifer told me to keep and didn't schedule another visit when Katie said she didn't want to go anymore. At my next support group meeting, Patricia mentioned that Major had been calling around to other military spouses trying to get dirt on me. She laughed, saying nobody would talk to him because word had spread about what he'd done. 20 years of helping other spouses through deployments and crisis meant they had my back now. Even the officers' wives who usually stayed neutral were telling him to leave me alone. The next morning, Margaret came over to help me update my resume, which hadn't been touched since before Tommy was born. She made me list everything I could do, which turned out to be a lot more than I thought. Project management, from coordinating battalion-wide events, and crisis handling, from managing family emergencies during deployments, and logistics, from executing 8 military moves. Margaret said military spouses are experts at everything except getting credit for it, and helped me translate my experience into civilian job terms. Jennifer called the next morning with news that made my stomach drop. She'd gotten David's financial records through Discovery and found something nobody expected. For the past 18 months, he'd been sending money to someone in the Philippines, a woman named Maria he met on some dating site while still living in our house. The transfers added up to almost $30,000, money he claimed we didn't have when Sarah needed braces or when Tommy's car broke down. Jennifer said his lawyer actually put his head in his hands when she showed him the bank statements during our next meeting. David tried to explain it away as helping a friend in need, but the emails Jennifer found said otherwise, full of promises about bringing her to America once his divorce was final. Tommy made his own discovery that same week when he was cleaning out the garage. He found David's old laptop from his first deployment stuffed behind some boxes and somehow got it working. What he found on there made him throw up in the driveway. Emails from 2004, right after Sarah was born, where David was asking his buddy about divorce lawyers and calculating how much child support would cost him. He'd written that he never wanted kids, that I trapped him with the pregnancy, that he was counting down to his 20 years so he could leave without losing his pension. Tommy printed everything and brought it to Jennifer without telling me first because he knew it would destroy me. When Jennifer showed me the emails, I couldn't breathe. Our whole marriage had been a lie. The chaplain who married us reached out after hearing about the divorce through the base gossip network. He asked me to come see him, said he had something he needed to tell me. Sitting in his office where we'd done our pre-marriage counseling 20 years ago, he admitted David had come to him during deployment number 5 asking about divorce. The only reason David didn't file then was because my dad died suddenly, and David didn't want to look like the bad guy leaving a grieving widow. The chaplain said he'd been carrying that guilt for years. The mediation session on April 15th turned into a disaster when we got to the house discussion. David demanded we sell immediately and split the proceeds, but I needed to keep the kids stable through the school year. The mediator suggested David could buy me out using his pension as collateral. David lost it completely. He jumped up screaming that I was stealing his retirement, that I didn't deserve anything after sitting on my ass for 20 years while he served his country. His lawyer tried to calm him down, but David kept yelling about how I was a parasite, a leech, that any judge would see I contributed nothing to the marriage. Security had to escort him out when he kicked a chair across the room. His lawyer apologized to everyone and asked for a recess, looking like he was reconsidering taking this case at all. Margaret extended her stay another week to help me prepare for a possible trial since mediation was clearly failing. We spent hours going through boxes in the basement, organizing 20 years of evidence I didn't even know I had. Every photo album, every scrapbook, every calendar where I documented David's absences and my single parenting became evidence. Margaret pointed out that what I called memory keeping was actually documentation of abandonment. We practiced testimony questions with Jennifer, role-playing what I might face in court. It felt like preparing for battle, except this time I was the one with ammunition. Jennifer called on April 20th with the news we'd been waiting for. David's retirement was official as of May 1st, and his pension was now locked for division. $4,000 a month he'd receive, and I was entitled to half of it for our 20 years of marriage. He couldn't hide it or claim hardship anymore. The numbers were set in stone by federal law. Sarah got her acceptance letter to art therapy camp that same day, something she never would have applied for when David was around, calling her drawings a waste of time. She'd been using art to process the divorce, creating these powerful pieces about family and loss that her teacher said showed real talent. Tommy helped her pack, the two of them closer than ever after everything they'd witnessed. They'd become each other's support system in ways that made me proud and sad at the same time. David made one last settlement offer through his lawyer on April 22nd. He wanted 70-30 custody in my favor but only 40% of the pension, and I could keep the house if I assumed all the debt he'd hidden, including the credit cards he'd opened in my name. Jennifer countered immediately with 90-10 custody, 50% of the pension, and he pays his own fraud debt. She said his financial infidelity and the Philippines situation made him look terrible to any judge. The best news came on April 25th when I got a call from a nonprofit in Denver that Margaret had connected me with. They wanted to hire me as their event coordinator, based on my FRG experience running military family programs. It was remote work that would let me be home for the kids while earning my own money for the first time in 20 years. During the interview, I talked about coordinating support for 300 families during deployment, managing crisis interventions, and organizing fundraisers that raised over $50,000. They said I was exactly what they needed. 3 weeks later, David's lawyer called Jennifer's office to withdraw from the case. I was there going over discovery documents when Jennifer put him on speaker speaker, and we heard him say he couldn't work with a client who kept lying to his own counsel. That made 4 lawyers in 5 months who'd dropped David as a client. The judge wasn't happy when we showed up for the next hearing, and David asked for another delay to find new representation. She leaned forward at her bench and told him any more delays would be considered bad faith, and she was setting a trial date for June whether he had a lawyer or not. David's face went red, but he just nodded and walked out without looking at me. That night, I took the kids to Applebee's to celebrate my new job, and Katie held up her apple juice and said we should toast to mommy being brave while Tommy raised his Coke and added something about new beginnings, and Sarah finished with her water glass saying here's to freedom. I started crying right there over my chicken tenders because for the first time in 20 years I had my own money coming in, and my kids were proud of me. Patricia calculating over $400,000 in unpaid labor makes me think about all those military spouses doing invisible work. How did she figure out the exact value of coordinating moves and running events? May 1st came fast, and instead of the big retirement ceremony I'd planned all those months ago, David cleared out his office alone in the rain. I drove by the base that morning to drop off some paperwork for my lawyer and saw him loading boxes into his truck by himself with no formation, no speeches, no honor guard, just a man in civilian clothes carrying 20 years of service to his car in wet cardboard boxes. The sight should have made me feel something, but all I felt was empty. 2 days before the trial date, I woke up at 3 in the morning, unable to breathe with my chest so tight I thought I was having a heart attack. Margaret found me on the bathroom floor shaking and held me while 20 years of stuffed down fear and anger came pouring out in ugly sobs that made my whole body hurt. She kept telling me I'd survive 20 years of this, so I could survive 20 more minutes in a courtroom, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. On May 5th, David's new lawyer called requesting one last mediation session, and when we got there, David looked smaller somehow, older, sitting across the conference table in a wrinkled shirt. He agreed to everything I'd asked for, except one thing. He wanted monthly unsupervised visits with Katie. My lawyer started to object, but I looked at Katie's picture in my wallet and knew she deserved a chance to know her father, even if I couldn't stand him, so I said yes. The settlement paperwork took 3 hours to draft and spelled out everything in black and white. I got primary custody, the house, half his pension, child support for all 3 kids, and alimony for 10 years. David got alternate weekends and Wednesday dinners, but only after completing anger management. 3 days later, we stood in front of the judge for the final hearing, and she spent 20 minutes reviewing everything we'd submitted. She looked directly at David when she said he'd dishonored both his uniform and his family through deception and financial abuse, and that our settlement was more generous than what she would have ordered at trial. David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Outside the courthouse, David caught up to me by my car and tried one more time with his manipulation, saying he'd loved me, that I should know that. I turned around and told him he'd loved having someone to come home to, but there was a difference between that and actually loving someone. Then I walked to my car and drove away without looking back, because his games didn't work on me anymore. The divorce was finalized that afternoon, and I officially went back to my maiden name Sullivan, while the kids decided to hyphenate theirs to Wilson Sullivan, because they said they were choosing both parents but defining themselves. May 10th came, and I sat in Jennifer's office with the final papers in front of me, and my hand was steady as I signed my name Linda Sullivan on every flagged page. 20 years of marriage ended with my signature on those papers, but instead of feeling like an ending, it felt like the first day of my actual life was finally starting. I walked out of that office and called Margaret from my car, and when she answered, I couldn't even talk at first, just made these weird crying sounds. She started crying too, and we sat there on the phone crying together for like 10 minutes before either of us said actual words. She kept saying she was proud of me and that she'd help me move forward, not just move on from all this. When I got home, the kids were already back from school, and I found them standing in front of David's military achievement wall in the hallway. Sarah had already started taking down his shadow boxes, and Tommy was helping her while Katie watched from the stairs. We spent the next hour replacing all his stuff with their own things, like Sarah's art pieces and Tommy's essays and Katie's soccer trophies. It became their wall now in their house, not some shrine to a man who picked his career over his family. 3 days later, I started my new job working remotely from what used to be David's study, and I cleared out all his military books and papers. The first paycheck stub I got 2 weeks later went right up on that wall where his promotion certificates used to hang, my own money that I earned myself without depending on anyone else's rank or career choices. The following Saturday, David came to pick up Katie for his first unsupervised visit, and she grabbed onto me so tight before going to the door. Tommy and Sarah stood behind me watching as Katie walked to his car, looking back at us 3 times before getting in. It was awkward as hell, but we kept it civil because that's what the court ordered and what the kids needed from us now. On May 15th, I went to my first FRG meeting since the divorce was final, and walked into that room as a divorced woman, not a military spouse. The newer wives looked at me different now, with respect instead of pity, and when they asked for advice, I just told them to document everything. Sarah finished her therapy program the next week, and her therapist said she'd developed really healthy ways to deal with everything that happened. Her final art project was this phoenix rising up from ashes, made of cut-up military uniforms, and I framed it immediately. The first pension payment and child support hit my account on the 20th, and I took all 3 kids to pick out whatever they wanted for their rooms. Tommy chose these dark blue curtains, and Sarah got fairy lights, and Katie picked out rainbow sheets and a unicorn lamp. Our house started looking like actual people lived there instead of some base housing copy where everything had to be regulation beige. Tommy graduated high school with honors on May 28th, and David showed up but sat way in the back by himself. When Tommy gave his speech, he thanked both parents, but then looked right at me and said, "Strength isn't about rank or power, but standing up for truth." 2 days later, on the 30th, Katie helped me plant flowers in the backyard for the first time time, ever since I never saw the point before. She got dirt all over her new shoes and asked if these were permanent flowers, and I told her, yes, baby, these are permanent. Memorial Day came, and I stood in my backyard watching the kids play on the swing set we'd just bought with David's pension money. The house was officially ours now, and my job started full-time on Monday, and everything felt like it was finally real and solid. I opened my laptop and started typing my story, beginning with the same words I'd written 20 years ago in my first journal entry. My mom was the definition of a military spouse, but I'm defining myself now, and I posted it online hoping maybe it would help someone else. Within an hour, I had dozens of messages from other military spouses asking how I did it, and telling me their own stories of waiting and sacrifice. I realized this wasn't just my story anymore, but something bigger that needed to be told for all of us who'd been invisible for so long. Man, I've had such a good time just bouncing around all these random questions with you today. Always fun to see where our curiosity takes us. Until next time, my friend, like the video, it helps more than you think.